Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, January 6th. You have a good weekend?
Uh, Not great, but not too bad either.
Okay, we will let's leave it there. We won't even
Yeah,
talk about
nothing
it.
very interesting.
I don't even know why I asked.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's been on your mind then? We'll start. I'll leave it open to you this time.
Okay. Well, Korea has been on my mind. We've touched on the developments in South Korea. We spoke earlier about the North Korean. I think it's fair to say hoax. The North Korean soldier hoax in Kursk. And I was just thinking about really the connections between the two. Maybe first let's go back to South Korea. And of course, we had the attempted coup and then the impeachment of the president, the attempt to arrest him, the prevention of that arrest by a military unit. And and then another story came out that his administration had been planning a false flag incident. They were going to attack and actually kill some high-ranking members of the government with people dressed up as North Korean soldiers. That was a story, and it just sounds so completely wild. But then, and maybe it's not true. But then later, you know, I don't know who looked into it, but it was determined that very recently an order had been placed for North Korean uniforms. And, so maybe there was something to it. Strange goings on in South Korea. And we've speculated that the U.S. has been involved in some way. I don't, there's no way to know. It's hard, like I say, to imagine they didn't know what's going on. And again, the more I think about it, and it's clear that there is a growing desperation within the foreign policy elite in the West. They know that they're losing this war, and to them as elites, I think really not to their countries, but to them, it's existential. This is something that they just feel like they can't lose. And one thing they've discovered, as we've noted earlier, is they just don't have the productive capacity to keep up with Russia. But there still is a lot of military production facilities out in East Asia, in particular in South Korea. So South Korea is actually a very, very potentially a very important component of their proxy war against Russia. Um, and and this president has shown himself to be just slavishly devoted to the globalist hegemonic agenda. Again, he's helped them with armaments in the past, with a great number of artillery shells that helped make possible the summer offensive of 2023. So you know maybe the West really is behind this. So, it's not impossible. And now just another thing, and now we have another connection. It's strange, this whole Korean connection, but many of these stories about North Korean soldiers, none of which have been verified, have been coming from South Korea. So they've been generating a lot of this propaganda. And of course, Ukraine has been too. I think yesterday, Zelensky did an interview with, um, what's the
Lex
guy's name?
Friedman. Lex
Lex
Friedman.
Friedman, exactly. Um, I don't find him very impressive, but he has, so, sometimes he gets really big name
Hmm.
people to come on his show. He interviewed Mearsheimer, I know, several months ago. Um, but on that, I actually saw parts of that interview. And in one place, they talk about the North Korean soldiers. And Zelensky says outright that there's 10 to 12,000 of them fighting. We've killed or severely wounded 3,800 of them. I don't know how he could know this and not have any evidence to show us, but he made that claim, and he said there may be another 30 to 40,000 coming in. So this is a story that just won't die. I remember when it first came up. What was it, 3 months ago? I kind of wonder what's going on. Could there be something to this? But it'll probably last a couple of weeks, like most of these things, and then just fizzle. But it just keeps on going. It keeps on going. It expands. It's embellished. They're getting a lot of mileage out of it. Um, and then you see, just through repetition, I think people start to believe things. When something's just repeated again and again, it just sort of becomes real. And you even find people on the Russian side Like I noticed DEMA, the military summary channel, claimed, I looked and saw the video, it was those little dots in the snow, and I don't know how you could know those were North Koreans. Um, and then Simplicius thinkers, said he seemed to believe in it. And he came up with a theory, which has actually been echoed by some other intelligent people, is that, well, it's not like the Russians need them, but maybe the North Koreans beg to be part of this to gain combat experience. And that's not utterly impossible. I think it's unlikely. Um, but the longer it goes on, I just like to say that the less likely, in my mind, is it's true. I mean, people who aren't thinking, you hear the repetition, you think, okay, well, it must be real. But if you get this constant repetition and these constant claims, and it goes on for a long time, and you still don't see the evidence, then it becomes even less believable. Because over time, some evidence, real evidence, should come through. And
Right.
just the fact that there isn't, actually, the longer it goes on, I think, the less possible that it's true.
Right.
And
It's like saying Biden is as sharp as a tack for 3 years, and then he gets out there and speaks, and you're like, "Whoops." Yeah, no, no, it's it's funny you mentioned the North Korean story because I just saw it on BBC News as well yesterday. I try to just watch a little bit every now and then just to see what the mainstream is talking about, and they had some South Korean official on there that they were interviewing, and he just said as a statement of fact that there were, I don't know, he said 10 to 20,000 North Koreans currently fighting in Ukraine, and how that's worrying for them, and how they're in this position where they have, China and Russia, these two huge nuclear powers that are, basically oppressive and surrounding South Korea and then also North Korea as well. And it just, coming from, if you're watching it, seeing a South Korean official saying this, or somebody that I don't know his position exactly, but coming from a South Korean, it just seems so much more legitimate, like, oh, well, they're right there next to North Korea. They must know.
yeah,
But
although
just
they're
to
a long
say
ways from Kursk.
that's true.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. So what do
Yeah.
you think is the end game of this North Korean story? Why are they pushing it
Well,
forward? What's the
yeah.
West?
Yeah.
What's their
Well, they've
plan?
actually, gotten quite a bit of mileage out of it already. It was used as a justification for um, lifting the restrictions on missile strikes into pre 2014 Russia. That's one thing. And then in general, it just kind of it increases fear on the Western side among the Western public. It's not just the Russians, it's the crazy North Koreans, are heading our way. And so I think the hope too is to just gain more popular support, scare the masses and get them in line and supportive of your project, Ukraine. And then it's also kind of part of the narrative that you see how desperate Russia is. They're falling apart. They don't have enough of their own soldiers. They have to depend on, the North Koreans because they've suffered such heavy losses. I think it feeds into that as well. So yeah, they are getting mileage out of it. And then probably I imagine the South Korean government too is, they want to create this fear within their own population. Now it seems to be, I have to say, failing in South Korea. I mean, this government is very unpopular. Obviously they have support from the U.S. and from elements in the military, and that's why he's still in power and hasn't been arrested. I'm talking about President Yoon. Um, but polls show that something like 90% or even better than 90% of South Koreans want him out of there. And another government would be, I think just much more reasonable. That the previous government and the likely future government will want to have good relations with Russia. I mean, the previous one did have good relations with Russia. And I think everyone's seen what a disaster the policy of the current government is. So there's really very little support for it.
You mentioned that there was this false flag story. Where did you hear about that? Where did that come from?
I heard that from Carl Jha. I guess, it was a kind of a big deal within South Korean media. I haven't seen it in, in any of the at any of the news outlets that I frequent. But it was Carl Jha is a reporter, a Chinese who covers East Asian politics. And he said, it came out, it was actually a blogger, who was well connected. and people were doubtful. But then physical evidence was produced that they had actually ordered these uniforms. Now, still, I don't know if that proves anything. There may have been an innocent explanation for these uniforms, but it makes you wonder.
What kind of innocent explanation?
I don't know.
They're doing reenactments, like Civil War with the costumes.
Right.
That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Definitely sketchy. Well, do you think that we will get a lot of answers when this government goes out? Because Yoon has to leave, right? There has to be an investigation. There's so many questions coming up now.
Right, I would think so. Just because, like I say, the popular opposition to him is so strong that I think people are going to demand. And actually, Koreans are very politically engaged people. I think really, more so than a lot of East Asians, and and I think they will demand an answer. And there should be, again, the opposition party should win handily in the next elections and be able to carry forth an investigation, I would think. There probably will be stonewalling, just like this president's still in power because he obviously holds on to some important levers of power within the military. And then apparently, like, he's trying to prevent Supreme Court appointments. There's one reason, like, they can't get rid of him is that you're supposed to have, there are 9 members on the Supreme Court, like in the U.S., but there are 3 vacancies, and you need to have a certain number of, I think, 6 of the justices to approve an impeachment, and start the proceedings. And because at least 1 or 2 of the current justices were appointed by him, they're not going to get it, and they're trying to fill the other 3, have the a full court, but he's managed to prevent that. Again, he does have his hands on some of the levers of power, so we'll see. That's really the battle right now.
So this false flag story, it's got to have to spread like wildfire through South Korea. Everybody is aware of this in South Korea?
So. Yeah. I think
so.
There's no
South Korean media is
right.
talking about it.
Right.
Well, if there's, that's just, you said that there's even a plot to kill some people within the government and have it posted.
According to this blogger, and again, I guess he's not just some sort of minor figure. He's again, one of the major, it's the new media, right? So, I don't know if he's the equivalent of Joe Rogan or something, but he's a major figure within South Korea.
I'm going to have to check some South Korean media and see what they're talking about, because that's just such a huge story. I only heard it from
Carl Jha, but Carl Jha, as I've found over the years, he's been very reliable. He should know. I doubt that he made this up. I can't believe that. It certainly must have happened.
Yeah, that's a huge. It's so treasonous. I can't imagine. Think about something like that. Like in our presidential election, if Trump or Biden, it was uncovered that that they were going to. Got a bunch of Russian uniforms and we're going to kill, Mitch Connell or something, and or whatever. Right. It's just it's wild, and then blame it all on the Russians.
Right.
That's a crazy story.
Right.
So if I imagine South Koreans have to be very upset or worried, at least about what's going on, and then when President Yoon gets deposed, removed from office, there has to be a big investigation. I imagine they will want answers.
Right.
Just play this hypothetical game with me. So if this false flag attempt was true, if the coup itself was something that was done in collaboration with the United States within the West, and then that gets all uncovered through an investigation when Yoon gets removed from office and the new government comes into power, what would that mean for? Wouldn't that just completely sever South Korea? Would be like, we're done with you, the United States. Yeah. You try to overthrow. Yeah. You try to kill our own government officials with this plot. You try to declare martial law for your own war. You're doing everything against the wishes of our own people, our own democracy. Stop meddling in our affairs. Or will they be like Germany and say, you blew up our Nord Stream pipeline. Thank you, master. Thank you for destroying our energy. We'll keep on doing whatever we want for you.
Yeah. I think that the South Koreans have a lot more backbone than the average Western European now. That they are fiercely independent and proud, And if again, I don't know that this story is true, but it's out there. If it turns out to be true, and then if it turns out that the U.S. was involved in the imposition of martial law or the attempted imposition of martial law in some significant way, I think there will be real anger and real repercussions, unlike in Germany. Now, I still think it's unlikely that the South Korean, very unlikely, I think that they would actually break relations with the U.S. But it would make those relations very frosty because they really are dependent on the U.S. for their defense. There's North Korea is a real wild card, and they're very heavily armed, and they have nuclear weapons, and I think that they do have South Korea does have legitimate defense needs, and they're unable at this point, because they've depended on the U.S. for such a long time, they really are unable to defend themselves, and they need that U.S. presence. But it would certainly strain relations and maybe put South Korea on a different course, saying, "Hey, we need to become independent." South Korea is a very prosperous society, with a very robust industrial sector, and they could, in fact, defend themselves. Like Europe, they've become dependent on the U.S., but maybe they could make the decision that, hey, let's depend on ourselves. But that would be a road, it would take years to go down that to get to that position. So I think even if they're just furious at the U.S. and decide that they do want to put distance between them and the U.S., they wouldn't, cut relations and the military relationship immediately, but they might look at it as a goal, years from now.
Right. I mean, I think if you're Japan or South Korea, it just seems like a bad move to rely on the United States for your defense because the U.S. power is waning while these other powers directly in your region, talking about China and Russia, are rising. It seems like if you want to address your security concerns, you need to talk to Russia and China. And I think they can be reached, but relying on the United States just means that you're going to be left hanging dry at some point. The United States can't stay there forever, and if the longer they stay, their relative power is declining day by day in relation to Russia and China. So if you had any type of foresight of these countries, you would say, okay, this isn't working out. And you can see that the amount of intervention and the meddling that the West is doing in our countries is self-destructive for us. It's not helping us. That they should start talking more with Russia and China to address their security concerns. And I'm sure these two big players, they don't want to see South Korea get wiped out. They want to have good relations with these countries. You said that South Korea had great relations or good relations with Russia prior to President Yoon. So do you think that's a possibility? I mean, that's kind of where it has to go to inevitably, right. I feel like.
I think in South Korea, definitely, that if a new administration comes into power, and it will, I don't think this President Yoon can stonewall for forever. The new administration will try to patch up relations to the extent possible with Russia. I don't know exactly what the relationship right now is between South Korea and China, but I think probably again this would be a more pragmatic, sort of a South Korea first kind of government that would come in, as opposed to one that puts the hegemonic interests of the U.S. above all. That's going to end when the new administration comes in.
Right. Yeah, this whole South Korea, North Korea story it's the gift that keeps on giving. It just keeps on giving us new stories.
It's really very
these North Koreans. I mean, in a way, what's happened for the North Koreans might be the most exciting thing that's happened since the Korean Civil War. In a way that they've been such an isolated country for so long. It's just North Korea was just this mythical place that nobody ever goes to, that very oppressed, and it didn't even seem like it was on planet Earth. And now all of a sudden in a way it's becoming integrated into the real world again. And I think the path for the North Koreans will actually be good. That they're going to see,
Yeah.
more economic ties, more opening up. They won't have to worry about these sanctions. The multipolar world will allow them to live their own crazy type of way of life, but to allow some type of openings as well, so that
Yeah.
we can see. I mean, it'd be crazy if you can one day we can just you can travel to North Koreans or see a North Korean, walking through Paris one day or something like that. Just they're
Yeah.
moving around. I mean, because
Not
you said
impossible.
that they're North Koreans in Moscow. Of
Yeah.
course,
Right.
military.
Again, yeah, your sister has seen 8 of them so far.
Oh, really? 8? So she's seen more now, huh?
Yeah, well, there were 4, and then again she saw 4. They could have been the same 4, so 4.
Oh, okay.
Say.
Okay.
That was again a couple months ago, not too long after the story first broke, and it was interesting. It just like because I remember back then the headlines in the Western media were like, are there North Koreans in Moscow? It was just like, well, yeah, there are. They're all just the metro. It shows that your reporters aren't really doing a good job. If you're writing the metro and talking to people, that they were there.
Right.
But
They're not hiding. They're not hiding.
Right,
They
right.
stand out.
Because that was the implication in a lot of the stories. In fact, they're actually dressed up as Russians, and they're lurking in the shadows, and said no. It's quite open. They had the North Korean uniforms on, and they were standing there on the metro train.
Yeah, that's interesting. Crazy. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Ukraine now, because we have had a bit of an escalation. There were 8 ATACMS missiles that were fired into the Belgorod region, and there was also a Kursk offensive by the Ukrainians. So, can you just tell us a little bit about these? Are these connected? What's going on?
Well, they may
there?
be, but it's not clear at this point. The 8 ATACMS, apparently all 8 of them were shot down. And so it's just another pathetic attempt. Again, the Russians have said that they're going to retaliate, but I think the fact that this attack didn't do any damage apparently means that the pressure to retaliate isn't very strong. And again, Donald Trump will be coming into office in just about 2 weeks' time. So I think the Russians have a very powerful incentive to limit their retaliation. So I don't expect to see anything major at this point. I just stop and think. I think this may be the 4th ATACMS attack. Since the restrictions were lifted, and they've just essentially done nothing. I mean, I think it's embarrassing. It should be embarrassing to Western leaders. Think of all these leaders that were just sort of chanting, let them fire those ATACMS. Constant refrain. You just heard it again and again. It was just like this is going to make the difference. Let's stop holding back the Ukrainians. They can't fight with one hand tied behind the back. You got to let them. Even Keir Starmer actually flew to Washington, D.C. and so on. So say, are you guys embarrassed now? You should be. They probably aren't, because they don't even really think about the consequences of their own actions. They're probably just thinking about the next escalation. But they should be just, thoroughly discredited by this.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Pentagon, that was always against this, I think they probably knew, hey, this is going to do virtually nothing and is very risky because it's going to invite Russian retaliation.
Right. It is embarrassing, and we keep on doing it. I think each one of these ATACMS missiles, I believe, cost $2 million.
And we don't have very many of them. That's the thing, is we're not even producing them at this point. This is a stockpile. I think maybe we stopped producing them in the early 2000s. And we had a stockpile of maybe a couple of thousand or 2,500. What I understand is that we gave 500 to Ukraine. This was when they were using them against the Donbass and Crimea, before the pre-2014 restriction was lifted. And according to a New York Times article, Ukraine was down to 50. When they began firing into Russian territory back in November. So I can't remember what exactly it is, but we're probably down to, if they haven't brought in more and that New York Times story was correct, we should be down to about 25 right now. And
Well,
those first
why have
25
we?
did nothing.
Right. Yeah. No, it's pathetic. It's like you said, it's embarrassing. It's pathetic. It makes the U.S. military, look impotent, primitive, and
Yeah.
crude.
Well, of course,
Even
they don't advertise this. Like when nothing happens, they just don't report the story when they're all shot down. If something gets through, then they play it up. But
right. It's
yeah,
yeah, it's true. Well, I've been, like I said, I try to follow just mainstream news about an hour or 30 minutes to an hour a day, just to try to catch the news stories. And I've been noticing that they have not been talking about Ukraine and Russia so much anymore. It's just kind of fading out of the news, which I guess means that it's just because it's all bad news.
I
So they
think
just
that's
don't
right.
talk. They just don't talk about it. It's
Right.
well, like you said, there's been four essentially volleys with ATACMS and Storm Shadows. That is this.
Yeah. Well, there was
Red,
also one. There was one that was a combination of storm shadows and attackums, I believe, or maybe storm shadow, and that did some damage. It was to some, I think, a depot in the Kursk region, and so a few personnel were killed, but it was not really significant damage.
right. So, anyways, this is a clear red line that Putin said don't do this. And
Right.
when they first did it, he used the Oreshnik. But
Right.
since then, we haven't really seen Putin do anything like the Oreshnik.
Right.
Obviously, he
Yeah.
hasn't used it again.
Yeah.
There were some things that we considered, could this be the retaliation where they did
Right.
large strikes on energy infrastructure and I think you said it was an SBU headquarters or
Right. And then, well, there was also that strike. We discussed. I had my theory on it. That they took out, I think, 4 or 5 HIMARS launchers that are used to launch the ATACMS, and then they also killed a large number of Western personnel. Particularly U.S. personnel in a couple of strikes, I believe in southern Ukraine. Yeah, but we haven't really seen since the Oreshnik. Those are all kind of doubtful. It's not clear. It seems to me that those are strikes that would have occurred anyway, with the exception of the Oreshnik one. And I think the reason is again is that is the change of the upcoming change of administrations. Trump came out and said that he thought this whole thing, the lifting of the restrictions was stupid, and he wanted to end it. And I think the Russians heard that, and he may have communicated some message to them through back channels too. It's like when maybe he said, when I come into office, this will end. And knowing that, there's really their incentive to retaliate is greatly reduced.
right.
So I think they're waiting now. If Trump comes into office and nothing changes, the strikes continue, then I think we can see some major retaliations from the Russians. But at this point, they're trying to hold off, wait and see. They have reason to be hopeful that in this case, there will be a change of policy.
Well, that's a great first start, though, in starting
Potentially, yeah.
to if Trump holds to his word and ends it, when he
Right.
gets into office right away, because then we start have a little basis of just the tiniest little bit of trust being
Yeah. It's a
regained by the
baby step,
Russians.
yeah.
And so, do you think that's quite promising? We had a long discussion a couple last week about whether or not Trump could end this Ukraine conflict, and we kind of walked away that saying that no, he can't, because first of all, is that trust that we might have that one little baby step, but the
Yeah,
trust
still
won't
not
be
enough,
there,
right? Yeah.
right? They know that if a new administration comes in place, they'll just tear up another agreement. I mean, they every kind of agreement that we've had with Russia, we just tear up, or we've openly said like, oh, it's a ruse, like Merkel openly stating publicly like,
Yeah.
oh, we were just tricking the Russians so we
right.
could pump more weapons into Ukraine and take them on. So it's not going to happen, or not a peace deal that I think Trump can walk away saying that he negotiated some type of victory for the U.S.
Yeah.
or
Well,
the
the
West.
problem again is like, like I've said, and Mark Sloboda has pointed out, is that, we are a party to this conflict. We like to pretend like somehow we're above it and we can impose a solution on both sides, but we're a party to it, and we're a party on the losing side. And so effectively, if we negotiate some sort of treaty, it's going to be a kind of a surrender, and that just something that the U.S. cannot do. It should have just avoided this entirely, by reaching an agreement, like through the Minsk Accords or the Istanbul Agreement, and just avoided all of this. But we've very foolishly went, full steam ahead, and now we see the consequences. Now we just can't back. If anything that we negotiate is going to be essentially a surrender. We're going to have to cede lots of territories and also accept the Russian demands on neutrality and so forth. That could have been done, earlier. It could have at really very little cost. But now the cost is so great that I don't see it happening. It's not possible.
You're right. When you say that we have to cede lots of territory, I think you're almost kind of, that might be the framework that our leaders view it at. This isn't our territory.
You're right.
That's
right.
what's crazy. But do you think that that's how people like Starmer and, the Blinken and Jake Sullivan, they view this as now part of the U.S. empire territory, and them losing it is just too painful? Is that what they view it that way?
I think it is in part. And it's just any kind of victory to the Russians, especially one that where we're the other side, is just, it may not, literally, it's not literally our territory, but it would be our loss. That's because we were so heavily involved in this.
So I know we've talked about this before, but I just thinking how this war is going to end, the more that we discuss this and go into it, I just don't really see it ending now in a way that if we can't achieve a peace deal, if we don't accept that these 4 Eastern oblasts will be part of Russia, then what are we going to see? I just don't think a sustainable peace with Russia is even possible.
It's actually, it's very, I don't think that there is ever going to be a treaty. It's clear that Putin really wanted to have some sort of treaty, some sort of general agreement, to create a new security architecture, as he put it, in Europe. But that's just not going to happen. He's accepted it. I think, again, it's just that we can't trust these people, and they simply do want to destroy us. And the other side just can't admit failure, even though clearly they are failing. So it's just going to go until the Russians say, well, I think we've taken enough of Ukraine, enough to, to provide us with the security that we need. They'll just they'll leave a dysfunctional, I believe, I know some people think that they may go all the way to the Polish border. I don't think they will. I think they'll leave a dysfunctional rump state, and they'll take one thing that's actually, it needs to be pointed out right now, we've talked about how in the Donbass, they've been punching through these fortifications. Actually, that phase of the battle, a very important phase that really started at the end of 2022 with the capture of Marinka, and then was followed by Avdiivka, was this conquest, this overcoming of the Ukrainian fortifications that have been built up over a decade. There's this belt of fortifications in the Donbass, and the Russians are now coming to the very, very end of that. And that'll be an important phase of the war. Okay, for obviously it has great military significance, but it also is kind of important to understand that area is very valuable, has great economic value. It's actually in a lot of ways it's the most valuable part of Ukraine. It's you notice in a lot of these battles that many of the fights actually take place around mines. It's a mining area. There's a great deal of mineral wealth in that part of Ukraine. And just very recently, I believe the Russians took a major lithium deposit. And lithium, of course, is extremely valuable mineral. It's used in battery technology, which of course has become extremely important. And that's something that Ukraine is losing. It was something that Russia was willing to see. This is your territory. Just be neutral and respect the Russian speakers on your land. and they wouldn't do that. Now they lost all that. And so anyway, that rump state that that Ukraine will probably be left with is going to be the poorest part of Ukraine. It's going to be, it doesn't have the best agricultural lands, and it doesn't have the mineral wealth. It doesn't have the industry. That really all is in the east. And then it doesn't have the coast, the access to the Black Sea, which is, where Odessa and Nikolaev are located. And I think it's very, very likely that the Russians will take that area in the south as well. Again, because it's actually, it's Russian speaking. The people there lean strongly towards Russia.
Right, but this rump state, will it just essentially become a NATO outpost, though, where NATO will just pump in?
Yeah, well, that's the danger. It really is, of course.
And Russia won't allow that, though, right? I mean, that's what started this whole thing to begin with.
Right. Yeah. Well, they just may make a decision. I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know, but they just may make a decision that they've had enough. That whatever's there is essentially neutralized and surrounded. I don't know. That's a really difficult question. I don't know what the answer is to that. I don't know if the Russians know either. I think they just know that they have to keep on pressing forward and see what happens.
Right, especially while they have the momentum and the advantage.
Right.
You don't want to give the enemy a reprieve to sort of understand all the mistakes, although I don't know if we're capable of learning from our mistakes. So far, it seems like we haven't. But to rebuild forces, sort of reindustrialize the military-industrial complex. But the West is in such a bad spot. I don't even think they're capable of reindustrializing because they cut off all the energy, all the gas. Like, how you expect to start turning on your war machine when you can't even keep the lights on now?
Right.
Commercially and residentially.
Yeah, certainly Europe, it's just pathetic. The U.S. potentially certainly could. The U.S. still does have a lot of cheap energy, and we'll see. I mean, it's not like, but it's going to take a real change of policy and an awakening, and it just to reality. I think it's just, again, the elites here are just so comfortable with the way things are. It's been the current arrangements are so lucrative that they just don't have the incentives to change. So we'll continue to have this kind of very bloated and inefficient and ineffective military-industrial complex into the foreseeable future. If there was a real awakening and say, hey, we look, they're outproducing us, we need to rebuild our industry. You can make a decision now, but it would take years, maybe even decades to get back to where really, because these are, you need the workers, the facilities, the supply chains, there's a whole kind of ecology that has to be reestablished. It's not just a matter of building a couple of factories. It's a whole network, a system, an ecosystem of factories that you have to build up. And that takes like a generation to do.
Right. Talking about maybe 20, 30 years. I mean, because we've outsourced it all to China. I mean, that's why China is a manufacturing belt. It's the agglomeration of industries that are there to create that type of logistics manufacturing belt. And we can't recreate that overnight. It's going to take a long, long time. Yeah, it's when I think about it, I feel like that we're at the stage that this war may just keep on going and Russia will continue just to grind forward. And the West has decided that this is the hill that they're going to die on. Yeah. And it might end with the collapse of the American empire, with the collapse of NATO, something like that. Do you believe that's true, that we will die on this hill? And
we very well could. I mean, it's just, I think we are deeply invested in it, much more so than in some of the other wars like Afghanistan, that we walked away from. We've walked away from a lot of wars. In the end, again, the U.S. could walk away from this war, like I've said, and it obviously would be a blow to U.S. prestige. It would be a real shock, but we could walk away from it and not suffer very serious consequences. But of course, it's Europe that's really suffering. It is already suffering from this. It's suffering not, directly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but but of
our
their own
response.
policies, right? That their response to this exactly that they've done at the bidding of the United States. But you have to say again, it's been willing. It's not like they're taking orders and carrying it out. It's just like they've really been brainwashed, and they've just kind of. So you have a lot of leaders that are really committed to this course, this very self-destructive course.
So, what do you think is more likely, that the U.S. will eventually walk away and then have to sort of hang its head in shame, be a big black mark on Trump's presidency, or that we're going to try to keep support in some form or fashion, and it's just going to grind on,
Yeah.
and on, but it's just going to keep on grinding on until there's going to be a collapse? I mean, we're coming close to a collapse. That's the thing. It's just like, how much can pumping weapons in doesn't seem to be doing a lot of good for Ukraine.
Right.
We finally got them those ATACMS that they were wanted to, like they're fighting with one arm behind their back, and we untied it and they pulled out the other arm, and it's just
well, you think about it,
knob,
it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's not just this, but that's been the story all along. It's the introduction of new weapons. Or another thing was remember the $61 billion package for Ukraine. And it was, the Republicans were holding out on that. And then there was all this hue and cry. It's like, we're depriving the Ukrainians of the much needed arms. That's why they're starting to lose. That's when Avdiivka, for example, fell, and it was a lot of the blame was placed on the Republicans, and then eventually, of course, with Trump's support, we have to remember, the package was passed, and the Ukrainians started to get this infusion of new funds and new weapons. It didn't make a bit of difference. Just look at the course of 2024, and it's actually after Avdiivka, it just the Russian advances accelerated. You would think that if this was really important, it was going to make a difference. You would see something like you would see a graph. Okay, this is when the new arms were introduced, and the Russians slowed. Significantly slowed their advance at that point. That did not happen. The advances accelerated through 2024. It did nothing. So that's just been the story all along, and there's going to be more of these. You just be sure of it. You're going to hear about some new weapon system or some new aid package that's going to turn the tide, that's going to make all the difference, and it will fail, and they'll forget that it failed, and then it'll be something else. I kind of see, it's just going on and on. I think it's going to be really hard. I think Trump actually, and some people in his administration, some, not all, not by a long shot, really do want to just walk away from this, but I think they're going to find it impossible to do. It's just, you just don't want to be the president that lost the war. But I don't know. I really don't know. It's where we put ourselves kind of like, again, between a rock and a hard place. There's just no good solution for the U.S. It's going to be hard for the Russians. It's like they're going to win, but like, again, I've said many times, an ugly victory. It's not going to be fully satisfying, whatever happens. But it's worse for the U.S. They're going to lose, and it's just sort of a question of how ugly that loss is going to be. And I don't. That's a tough one. I don't know how they're going to deal with it. It just may go on and on and on, like you say. It's really quite unfortunately. Maybe there just has to be a coup within Ukraine or something. I don't know.
Yeah, Ukraine has turned into this bottomless pit that the West is just constantly throwing money down, Ukrainian lives down, and military equipment down, and it just gobbling everything up. Do you think at some point that bottomless pit will just swallow the U.S. empire? We keep on throwing. You can't do it forever, right? There's a limit. Our debt is over $36 trillion. Our military is exposed. Apparently we got problems around the whole world. Our vassal states. We got the Middle East. Just talking about South Korea.
Right. It's obviously a strain on the U.S. empire. I think if you look at the amount of money spent, it's significant, but it's still just a small percentage of how much the U.S. spends on various things, every year. The problem really is the armaments. It's just that we have, because of Ukraine, we've drawn down our stockpiles. We're just talking about the ATACMS. We had a stockpile of ATACMS, and apparently, they're actually a very important part of our military and of a foreseen conflict, for example, in East Asia. They like the Pentagon has made it clear that we have to keep a certain number of ATACMS for that, and I think we're probably coming to for them what is the bare minimum. Yeah, and that's what's happening on with respect to many kinds of armaments, especially air defense missiles. That those stockpiles are long gone, and again, Israel is in first in line. They're getting it, and there's just very little to go around it for anybody else, including for the U.S. itself and NATO itself. That's a hard reality that they've come up against, and I don't know how they're going to deal. At this point, they're just drawing a certain amount from monthly production and giving a certain percentage to Ukraine. But it clearly isn't enough. So, there'll always be talk that we need to do more, but there really is nothing more that we can do.
Yeah, you mentioned that the ATACMS are no longer in production. I also heard that.
Yeah.
But why are they no longer in production? If there's an important part of our armament, then clearly it's a problem. If you stop producing them, then you don't think they're that important, right?
Yeah, well, we made a lot of them, apparently. I mean, yeah, it's just like this. It's clear that we weren't really preparing for a real war with a pure adversary. And that all these very expensive weapon systems, some of these weapons are fairly effective, but they're all very expensive. And that was almost the point. He said we make expensive things. The more expensive it is, the better for everybody concerned. That's the way they think about it. It wasn't, okay, look, we may be in a war in 10 years and we must have these things. That's the stated justification. Whenever like the Pentagon rolls out a budget and, its budget requests, you say, well, we have these warfighting needs. But I think the reality that everybody knows, because we haven't fought a real war with a pure adversary in such a long time, that it's become this game, again, where the lobbyists and the congressmen and and above all, the arms manufacturers make huge amounts of money. And that game is just going to continue. It was, so yeah, ATACMS were made and a lot of people made a lot of money off of it. If they were really thinking about a war with a pure adversary, they wouldn't have stopped production. But it was probably somebody came along with a new weapon system that had an even higher price tag. So clearly, hey, ATACMS is kind of boring. Now this is actually the profit on this is getting lower and lower. Let's introduce something new. We'll attach a lot of bells and whistles to it. It's probably no better than the ATACMS, but it's going to be 3 times as expensive and we'll be 3 times as rich.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
That's very cynical, but I think that's the reality. Right. I don't think anybody can deny that.
I mean, I was thinking the only reason that you would stop making the ATACMS is because you have something new and improved. Like you're not making the iPhone 4 anymore. We're on, I don't even know what iPhone we're on, but anyways, we're on the newest one.
We're way past that, right?
Right. So that's why we're not making these anymore. But then I haven't seen the replacement, so to speak, of the ATACMS, if there is one. What is it? And why would they not give them to Ukraine? And, part of what you said makes sense is that if they did upgrade it, first of all, who knows how effective it really is, if it really is a big improvement. And then, like you said, that it's going to cost a lot more money. And I'm sure the production levels are going to be even lower. Instead they roll out like those SM-3 interceptors, the Navy interceptors. You told me that they only produce 12 a year.
Right.
And there was that volley from the Iranian attack? They fired 12.
The last one. I think they
fired
fired all
12. They didn't hit a single thing, right? I don't think they intercept a single thing.
You got to wait till next year, right?
Right. That was a whole year's supply of production. So this whole thing is, that's like we're saying that. So this Ukraine is this pit, and okay, maybe we can, because we have the printing press, we can throw money down there for a long time. Eventually, it will break our economy, but we can keep on chucking money. But we can't keep on chucking armaments down there because we just can't make them anymore, and we're getting desperate for them. And we can't keep on chucking lives down there because the most horrific part of this whole conflict is that we're running out of Ukrainian lives to throw down there. So that's why they are wanting to lower the conscription age to 1825 because there's not enough people above the age of 25 that are left to fight this war. And then you put in the age of 1825, you basically have sacrificed the whole future of Ukraine. I mean, how are you going to have a future generation? These are the people that are your future. They are the ones that are going to have kids. Right. And I'm sure a lot of people aren't having children in Ukraine just because of the conflict that's going on. It's not really conducive to that type of environment. You're going to essentially lose. Ukraine has no future now.
Right.
That's
no,
what
that's
it
really
is.
true. I mean, it's the demographic future is very bleak. I think we're looking at the end of Ukraine in a few generations. Essentially what happened in Ukraine is the 1990s never stopped. Russia suffered a horrible decade, a disastrous decade, in the 1990s, and their, fertility rates plummeted, their mortality rates skyrocketed, especially among men. But starting, around 2000, which was right after when Putin took office, things have steadily improved in Russia. And, again, your sister has been a witness to this. She went there 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and then, made other trips. And every time she visited Russia, she could see things were getting better. There just was and they continue to improve, to this very day, even through the war. But that never happened in Ukraine. It's just like the corrupt government, the oligarchs, they never went away, and the 1990s just continued to fester. And so, fertility rates have remained very low. And what you find is like, there's a healthy number of 50-year-olds, but very few 18-year-olds. And that was one reason, I think maybe the main reason, that the Ukrainian government was reluctant to conscript young men, is that they know that demographic is particularly meager. There just aren't very many of those Ukrainians left. And you by conscripting them, sending them to the front, and where many of them are going to die, you are putting the future of Ukraine at risk. I think you have to say even more than at risk. You really are kind of
extinguishing it.
Yeah, choosing to extinguish Ukraine, right?
Sad. It's awful.
No, it really is. It's a horror story.
I think, we talk about this conflict not being able to end, with a treaty, with a negotiation that it might kind of grind on, which just means that there will be more and more lives lost, more and more armaments. Eventually will come to an end when there's nothing left to throw into this pit. But a lot of it, I think, at the end of the day, stems from this demonization of Russia that will keep it going, that we have demonized it. And it's just something that's been part of the U.S. DNA almost for 80 years, and not the Western European DNA as well. That there's just this visceral hatred and fear of Russia. And I just think that will always, as long as that's there will be that base that we can add fire to continue throwing Ukrainian lives and the U.S. empire down this Ukrainian bottomless pit. Is there any way that we can end that demonization? Like, this type of stuff, right. That's the root of the problem. Right. We got to be able to look at Russia as not just evil,
Yeah. There are hopeful signs. We've spoken about the rise of certain political parties in Europe, both Western and Eastern. But we've also spoken about the establishment's authoritarian and very anti-democratic reaction to to the rise of these parties. But it may eventually, one may break through, and it appears that that's about to happen in Austria. I believe it's the Freedom Party in Austria, which it's called far right. Again, far right probably, what they call far right would not have been called far right earlier in my day. Like their position, which is important for what we're talking about here on the Ukraine conflict, is that we should remain neutral, and we should end support for Ukraine, and promote a peaceful solution. So this apparently is far right. That used to be sort of what leftists said, when I was young.
Right.
But anyway, now somehow it's called far right. But so that's hopeful. If the Freedom Party takes power in Austria, then we have Orban's Hungary, we have Fico's Slovakia, and then we'd have a third country, a very important country, Austria. Actually in Western Europe. And maybe Italy, too, could flip. I've talked about the public sentiment. It's very, very strong against supporting Ukraine there. So, again, there is reason to be somewhat hopeful within Europe.
Okay. All right, let me ask you one last question. If things don't go the way that Trump plans in Ukraine, he isn't able to end with a treaty with Putin and able to hold his head up high with it. It ends up dragging on. Do you think this increases the likelihood that Trump would do something like attack Iran or decrease it?
Yeah, well, I think Iran has always been a separate question for him. He has always been kind of an anti-Iran fanatic. But I think I don't know. I think it's a separate question, to be honest. I mean, I think there's just part of him that wants to bring about the overthrow of the Iranian regime, as you would call it. And it just remains to be seen. I don't think he can do it. That's the thing, that Iran is not Syria. Iran actually, while Syria was just a kind of an economic shell, the Iranian economy is growing stronger and is as allies. They're on the verge of signing this comprehensive agreement with Russia. That's going to happen just in about 2 weeks. Yeah, I guess the short answer to the question is I don't think it'll affect. He has his own plans for Iran, but he's talked about increasing sanctions. I don't even know how he can do that because they've already, I think, slapped every sanction on Iran that possibly could be slapped on them. Sort of similar to what they've done to Russia. They fired that gun several times already, and I think that there aren't any more bullets in the chamber. So I don't think he can do it. And then also I don't, though he hates Iran, he also does not want to involve the U.S. in a new war, and that's what would happen. I mean, clearly Netanyahu wants to do it. But I think he'll be reluctant to, and the Pentagon is very reluctant to. It's going to be interesting. I'm not going to make any predictions because there are factions within the U.S. government that are gung ho to attack Iran and to actually go to war against them, and obviously the Israeli government is for. So there are powerful forces arrayed in this. And then again, Trump has kind of shown he's both I think a possible willingness to go along with it, but also there's maybe the better side of his nature is reluctant to go along with it. We'll just I wouldn't put any money on either side of that wager. Mm-hmm. I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, the reason I asked that is because I think, Trump has a bit of an ego. He likes to appear as a strong man.
Right.
If he doesn't do well with this Ukraine conflict,
well, you may be right.
It.
Right, you may be right. That's certainly true. That may be what he'll just he'll think about it. I gotta win somewhere. I gotta show that I'm tough somewhere.
Right, and it's kind of just what we see when people are in a losing position in the West is instead of, walking away when you're down, they just double down on stupid, and they start chucking grenades to create a distraction or just go for Hail Mary passes, and that's just what I'm afraid of. That
you may be right.
Damn,
right.
I promised everybody that in this Ukraine conflict it didn't happen. Everyone says I'm weak or incapable. Mm-hmm. Russia continues advancing. All right, well, we'll show them, and we'll take out Iran's nuclear facilities. Let's go. We're doing it. Green light it.
Yeah,
we got close. There was that Axios article. We won't get into this now about Biden and Jake Sullivan having a discussion on.
Yeah, seriously considering an attack on Iran, right?
Right.
Well, we've gotten close many times in the past, to be honest. I mean, this is going way back to the George W. Bush administration. There have been close calls on this, and I'm afraid one of these days, the hotheads are going to win the argument, and it'll happen. And it may be for the reasons that you stated. Yeah, you're right. When I think about it, it's just that. Also, you may just think like, okay, we can't take the Russians on directly, but Iran is a Russian ally. That's their kind of like the soft underbelly. I think that they're actually not such a soft underbelly, but it may be the way that Trump and some people in the U.S. government think. Let's hurt Russia through Iran, and plus we also just want to hurt Iran, of course. But we get a twofer for that. We can show that we can come back if we succeed with this attack and say, yeah, we've protected Israel and we've also hurt Russia. That could be the way they go at it. Yeah.
Is it bad that I almost want it to happen, because I feel like this is the only thing that's going to kind of bring down the American empire, stop Israel, and I just feel like it has to happen, because if it doesn't, we'll just keep on going, wasting money and lives. Do you almost feel like it would be the better solution? We do it, we get our butts handed to us.
Well,
but it's also scary because it could just explode. Exactly. It could just explode.
Exactly. Well, that's the whole thing. Is that I think clearly, I think we're going to. If we become engaged in these conflicts directly, I think we're likely to lose, or to suffer some really terrible losses. We'll just say, but there's a sort of inevitability about it. I think because of the narrative that's been constructed, the course that we're on, that there's going to be some kind of collision, and that collision is going to be very, between Russia and Iran on one side, and possibly China and NATO, or and Israel and the U.S. on the other side. There is going to inevitably be some kind of direct collision, and that's going to be very scary. That could be the beginning of World War III, but it, maybe, especially if we fall flat on our face, maybe it won't be. I don't know. Again, we're in interesting times. We'll see.
Okay. Well, let's end it there then, Dan.
Okay.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too.